Hello, my name is Shermaine Barrett and welcome to this lecture on transformational or transformative learning theory. At the end of our lecture, we would have defined transformational learning. We would look at some key concepts of transformational learning. We'd look at transformational learning from Mezirow's perspective. And from that perspective, we will look at the process of transformational learning, some essential elements of transformational learning, Mezirow's assumptions of adult learners, and finally, we will look at the role of the adult educator in fostering transformational learning. Transformative learning gives focus to the social and critical dimensions of adult learning. The theory was developed by Jack Mezirow in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He used this theory to describe how people develop and use critical self-reflecting to consider their beliefs and experiences, and over time change dysfunctional means of seeing the world. At the heart of transformational learning is the idea of fundamental change in perspective or frame of reference. Mezirow was interested in people's worldviews and what leads people to change their particular view of the world. And so he describes transformative learning as learning that transforms problematic frames of reference to make them more inclusive, discriminating, reflective, open, and emotionally able to change. So what does the term frame of reference mean? A frame of reference is a complex set of assumptions and attitudes by which we filter perceptions to create meaning. They predispose us to see the world in a certain way. The frame can include beliefs, schemas, preferences, values, cultures, which bias our understanding and judgment. So, for example, I look at a group of young people wearing hooded sweatshirts and immediately assume they are social deviants who are out looking for trouble. So I avoid eye contact and breathe a sigh of relief once they have passed by. In this scenario, I have made some assumptions about these young people and went ahead to act upon those assumptions. According to Mezirow, transformative learning theory explains how adult learners make sense or meaning of their experiences, how social and other structures influence the way they interpret that experience, and how the dynamics involved in modifying meanings undergo changes when learners find them to be dysfunctional. Basically, Mezirow's theory argues that every individual has a particular view of the world. The particular worldview may or may not be well articulated, but it is usually based on a set of assumptions that originate from the individual's upbringing, life experiences, culture, or even education. So here are some key concepts that we should be aware of. They are critical to transformative learning. The first is experience. Then there is critical self-reflection, change or development, context, rationality and effect, relationships, and social action. And we'll see how these concepts work out as we look further down at the transformative learning theory. Jack Mezirow presents a 4-stage process in transformative learning, and we are going to look at those. Here, it begins with a grappling with a disorienting dilemma. And here it is, experience is coming out. And in order to deal with this disorienting dilemma, Mezirow argues that we engage in critical assessment and examination of our assumptions. And based on that examination, we acquire new knowledge. And then that new knowledge we act out with the revised perspective. Let's look a little deeper at each of these. Grappling with disorienting dilemmas. So, a triggering event, which is what is called the disorienting dilemma, leads to an awareness of inconsistency amongst our thoughts, feelings, and actions, or a realization that previous views and approaches do not seem adequate enough any longer. And so a self-examination, sometimes with feelings of guilt or shame, or just a feeling of disequilibrium, overtakes us. Then there is a recognition and articulation of assumptions and presuppositions that were long held and often unconsciously. Let's look at critical assessment. This may involve a critical assessment of epistemic, sociocultural, or psychic assumptions, a questioning and examining of assumptions and viewpoints, including where they came from, the consequences of holding them, and why they are important. In terms of acquisition of new knowledge, this may include an engagement in reflective and constructive discourse, which is a type of dialogue in which alternative viewpoints are discussed and assessed, and it includes an exploration of options for new roles, relationships, and actions. And this leads us to act out the revised perceptions and a revision of our assumptions and perspectives to make them more discriminating and justifiable. When Mezirow looks at acting out our revised perspective, he speaks about us acting on the revisions that we have made and building our competencies and self-confidence in new roles and relationships. And so there are 3 essentials for transformational learning. One is communication skills. Second is rational discourse. And thirdly, the readiness for transformation. Let's look at each of these. First, we have communicative skills. An essential element of Mezirow's theory is the need to develop communicative skills so that conflicts, both internal and external, which result from changes in perspective, can be resolved via rational discourse rather than force. In terms of rational discourse, Henderson points out that discussion is a critical aspect of transformative learning. And Mezirow argues that rational discourse demands complete and accurate information, freedom from coercion or distortion or self-deception, an ability to weigh evidence and assess arguments objectively. It also demands an openness to other points of view, an equal opportunity to participate, critical reflection of assumptions, and a willingness to accept informed, objective, and rational consensus as a legitimate test of validity. In terms of readiness for transformation, Mezirow encourages that transformative learning is self-awareness and readiness for the experience. Transforming existing ways of thinking and doing cannot be forced or mandated, and so it requires people to be convinced that there is indeed a need to be transformed. Further, transformation involves some unwavering, which implies that learners will need to be willing to examine old knowledge in light of new perceptions, new situations, or new demands. Mezirow further looks at some assumptions about adult learners. And he argues that there is no such thing as a value-free education. Adult educators are never neutral. The most insidious effects of power are when people feel insecure enough not to have a voice, and therefore they do not participate. So what is the purpose of transformative learning in adult education? These include to encourage learners to participate in dialogue, to promote critical reflection and critical self-reflection of assumptions. It includes encouraging learners to take action based on reflective practices. Also, it seeks to encourage learners to set out their own assumptions and to find out those of others, their values, their beliefs, their feelings, and their purposes. And so we go to now to look at the educator and their role in fostering transformative learning. A key first step is to create a trusting classroom climate. Studies have shown that transformative learning is fostered by establishing supportive and trusting relationships. This forms the foundation for dialogue and discourse. This requires creating a learning climate that is supportive and open to differing perspectives, both on the part of the facilitator and the learners. The role of the educator is also to provide opportunities for critical thinking. Transformative learning goes hand in hand with self-reflection. It involves challenging the assumptions on which people rely to understand and interpret their world. So teachers need to create opportunities for critical thinking by providing content that introduces new ideas. Students then need to use these opportunities to engage with new content through journaling, dialoguing with other students, and critically questioning their own assumptions and beliefs. Educators also need to provide opportunities for students to relate to others by going through the transformative process. Because transformation often happens in community as students bounce ideas off one another and are inspired by the changes made by others. The adult educator also needs to provide direct and active experience for the adult learners. Research has shown that one of the most powerful ways to foster transformation is through the opportunity to engage in direct experience that provides the opportunity for students to act on their own found beliefs. And there is some indication that true transformation cannot take place until students are able to actively take steps to acknowledge their new beliefs. So, in this lecture, we defined transformative learning. We looked at some key concepts of transformative learning. We looked at Mezirow's perspective of transformative learning and the process that is involved in transformational learning. We looked at some essentials for transformational learning to take place. And finally, we looked at the role of the educator in fostering transformational learning. It's now time to reflect. Can you identify any assumption that you may have about your learners, or otherwise that you may need to be transformed? Can you identify at least one thing that you will do differently with your learners to foster transformational learning in them? That's it for today. Thank you and see you next time.